1897. It's a couple years later. And so Debs is a devout Christian. He will end up, as it turns out, as a radical socialist, but it'll take a little while for that to happen. Debs is trying to organize the American Railway Union, a union of railroad workers, all railroad workers, not just stevedores or freight handlers or engineers or switchman operators or whatever. And so these desperate Pullman workers come to Debs and they say, gosh, we don't know what to do. People are being thrown into the teeth of these blizzards. The unions we tried to start have been crushed by Pullman. And so Debs decides to take up their case. And he decides to try to get the American Railway Union to strike on their behalf. And so that's what happens in 1895. The Pullman workers go on strike. You see them protesting in front of the arcade building in the first picture I showed you. The American Railway Union also protests, and these protests metastasize rapidly in the upper Midwest, like the 1877 railroad strike, right? You end up with all the railroad workers, you end up with freight handlers, Pullman porters, you end up with switchyard operators, telegraph operators, everybody's striking all together in sympathy with these Pullman workers who can't seem to get a break, right? And so what happens is that the governor of Illinois is actually sympathetic. He says, gosh, these guys, they're not asking Pullman to like give them the keys to the bank. They're asking him not to evict them from their homes in the middle of the winter, and he's not like going to rent these homes to somebody else, right? It's not like there's someone else coming along. He's firing these people because the business can't support it. Let them at least stay in their homes. Give them a break here. And so over his head, the Attorney General for the state of Illinois, in cooperation with the General Managers Association, is a trade group of railroad owners who are very threatened by the strike. So the Attorney General of Illinois and the General Managers Association, they go to the federal district attorneys and they get an injunction calling the strike a conspiracy and restraint of trade and in violation of the Commerce Clause of the U.S. Constitution. So that gives them the authority to send in the National Guard, right? And so Debs fights it in court and loses the case. And the National Guard goes in with essentially predictable kind of monotonous results, right? And they march in, the workers are striking, gunfire and everything. For a while the strike held for several weeks before the gunfire and the violence really started. But when they finally got the workers in, is the workers refused to unload or move trains that had Pullman cars, right? That was the tactic they used. So what the government started doing is putting on trains and Pullman cars mail bags. And impeding the delivery of the mail is a federal crime. So, if the workers refuse to unload the freight on that train, there's criminals, right? Because they're not handling the mail, right? And so, as it turns out, what the workers would do is they search the trains, find the mail bags, and deliver them, right? So then they started hiding the mail in unmarked bags. And then having the police search the trains and find the mail that had not been delivered, right? And so the non-delivery of the mails is what gives them the sort of legal justification to go in and attack the workers. And then again, as you might imagine, people get killed, the Pullman strike gets broken, the American Railway Union suffers quite badly. Debs is pretty thoroughly radicalized by the whole experience. And he goes to court and argues that the government uses injunctions to prevent strikes. An injunction is like a court order, and it's important to understand that a strike, if you view a strike as a First Amendment expression of the freedom to protest, then it's totally legal and you can't stop it. But remember, judges can use court orders to stop things that are otherwise legal, generally like pending litigation, right? So like if you're going to publish a book and somebody sues you over the book, then a judge can issue a court order and say, you have the First Amendment right to free speech to publish this book, but I'm going to ask you to sit on the book until you finish getting sued about the book, and once we know who owns the book, you can publish it, and it's your business, right? And so using a court order, a judge could prevent a strike, even if the workers argued that the strike is a protected First Amendment action, that the judges could order an injunction. And then if you strike, you're expressing your First Amendment rights, but you're also violating the court order, which is a crime, right? And so Debs argues that that process is unconstitutional, that the very idea that the judges can effectively use a court order to prevent strikes, it amounts to sort of de facto violation of the First Amendment, right? It's not, each individual strike is considered in theory on its merits, but in practice, judges just use injunctions to cancel strikes and make them effectively illegal, right? And so the court, federal court in 1885 is called In Re Debs. They throw out that argument and they say that judges are not illegalizing strikes as a class, but instead considering on its individual merits whether each strike is legal, then they're not violating anybody's rights. And so Debs walks away from this pretty thoroughly radicalized. and in the early 20th century is involved in the creation of a union called the International Workers of the World, the Wobblies, the IWW they're known as. And the Wobblies are really much more avowedly socialist than any other union in American history. When you talk to Debs about the Wobblies, he would say, yeah, you know, we're a union, but we're also like a socialist political movement as well, right? And the very name, International Workers of the World, is intended to link the Wobblies to the European labor movement and to socialists in Europe, right? The very last line of the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels says, arise workers, you have workers of the world, unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains. Right, and so it's deliberately intended to be a callback to the Communist Manifesto. And so Debs, we're going to see him again because he's going to run for president a couple times. He gets, I think, a career high for a third-party candidate and a socialist candidate in American political history. I think he scores like 12% of the vote, and I want to say it's like 1908. And so, having said that, Debs though was sort of thoroughly left, sort of disabused of the American labor system. In the 1870s and 80s, he was a devout Christian. He abhorred violence. By the 1890s, his opinion is if the workers can't get what they want through political action, through labor movement, or organizing strikes, then maybe there has to be some kind of revolution. Right? I mean, maybe it has to be, you know, we've got to go and actually, you know, like organize ourselves and overthrow the current system of government. And so you might say that the 19th century is a very interesting time for the labor movement. On the one hand, basically the labor movement is formed. Unions become a thing, workers get organized. The spread of factory work makes unions extremely, extremely easy and effective to organize. Workers see them as being valuable, but at the same time, the unions enjoy almost no political sort of legitimacy at all, right? Even Democrats and Republicans alike view unions as fundamentally sort of illegitimate foreign agencies, right? These are not workers trying to better their lives. They're evil, you know, socialist conspirators or something. And so it won't really be until the 20th century when unions enjoy any kind of legal status that leads to something resembling like political power, right? So if you think of today, for example, Democrats being associated with unions, union workers often vote Democrat and help them elect politicians and stuff. That it doesn't happen until the 20th century. Right? It will take unions enjoying some kind of what people see as like a legal status or legitimate status, right? And to be totally fair, a lot of it will have to come down to federal laws, right? Today, for example, strike breaking is illegal. It's of course a crime to hire someone to beat someone up, but to hire someone to beat someone up to break up a strike is actually a federal crime. To threaten to break up a union by firing members who are organizing is called union busting. There's an episode from years ago now, but of The Office, where the workers in the workers in the paper shipping factory are going to unionize, and when the boss Jan Levinson Gould gets word, she has a meeting with them where she tells the boss that if you guys unionize, we'll give you higher wages, but you're going to have to fire like a third of your staff. And so the boss of the factory actually shuts the whole thing down and stops the union in its tracks because he doesn't want to have to fire a bunch of his workers. What Jan did was actually a federal crime. That's union busting. You're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to threaten. If you unionize, I'll have to fire all of you. That's a federal crime. She wouldn't be allowed to do that. And so there's no federal laws preventing anything like that in the 19th century. So I mean, obviously we'll have to see, right? And if you think of the unions as being a very potent constituency of the Democratic Party in the 20th century, first they would have to be a thing that is even remotely legal, right? I mean, it has to be a thing that people think should exist, right? So we'll return to that issue in a while, right? But you could say that in the 19th century, things seem to change incredibly rapidly in the 19th century. My wife's grandmother told her in the 1960s, late 1960s, she said, you know, when I was a little girl, I went out to Texas in the back of a covered wagon, and they literally dodged Indians. They literally dodged Comanche Indians. They had people got scalped in the area. They you know, locked all the doors at night. And, you know, if you saw somebody moving outside, you got the gun, kind of the thing. And she said all of that was my youth. And she said, yeah, I lived to see a man land on the surface of the moon. And so there's this incredible amount of technological and social change in a very short period of time, relatively speaking. A lot of it happened in the 19th century. Things like, restaurants, public bathrooms, the telegraph, electric lighting, railroads, subways, streetcars, automobiles, department stores, mass-produced consumer goods, all of those things appeared in a very short period of time in American history. And some of the stuff you could buy, Coca-Cola, Heinz ketchup, Hershey's chocolate, still exists today. This would be shockingly modern if you wandered into a store in New York City in the 19th century. But at the same time, there's this huge amount of social change behind those economic changes. Right? All those factories represent people leaving the farms, coming from Europe, coming from rural areas, going into tenements, working in sometimes awful conditions. And the political system, for a lot of people, doesn't seem like it's really caught up to it. It doesn't really seem like we haven't really figured out how to assimilate these changes into our political system in like a meaningful way. And people increasingly begin to point out what they see are very serious problems with the industry, right? I mean, like giant amounts of corruption. You know, Nelson Aldrich gets hundreds of millions of dollars from the sugarcane companies. Upton Sinclair, in the early 20th century, is a socialist writer, writes a novel intended to be propaganda to try to convince meatpacking workers to go and unionize. And his very vivid descriptions of the awful conditions of the meatpacking industry, and then also called The Jungle. The very, very vivid descriptions of the awful conditions of the meatpacking industry don't actually convince many people that meatpackers should unionize. They do convince people that the government should regulate the meatpacking industry because it's awful. There are these descriptions of meat thrown on the floor and piled up and then scooped up and canned later. They sometimes can up rats with the meat because the rats are living in piles of meat and there's rat droppings everywhere. People routinely get fingertips and stuff cut off by the machine, then it just goes into the can. They can a rotten meat. And so everybody who reads Upton Sinclair's novel doesn't walk away thinking, gosh, those poor workers, they really should, they go to work thinking, I'll never eat canned meat again. This is horrible. And so the government passes the FDA and the USDA. And so it's seen by a lot of people that maybe we have to rethink how the government works because the government was conceived at a time where there wasn't giant factories, huge concentrations of people living in cities, giant concentrations of wealth, small numbers of companies running huge industries that affect everyone's lives. And so there's discussion about the fact that maybe that sort of has not really worked out, right? And so we'll have to think about that. Having said that, we'll return to these themes, right? In a sense, this is going to be the ground that a lot of 20th century American politics will be fought about. Should the government regulate the economy, or is that, in fact, a bad idea and would produce worse results? All right. One thing that we can mention that's very significant is that people begin to detect what we call often today the business cycle. There's not a great sort of name for it, but basically, if you look at the economy, sometimes it grows, and then sometimes it collapses, and then sometimes it grows, and then sometimes it collapses. And nobody's really sure exactly why this functions the way that it does. We don't know, but it appears in American history to go on a 20-year cycle. The 1890s, the 1870s, the 1830s, the 18-teens, the 19-teens, the 1930s. And so sometimes the economy expands, businesses are created, workers get hired, wages go up. Sometimes the economy contracts. And sometimes it stays shrunk for a long time, right? But when it shrinks, it's a recession. When it stays shrunk, it's a depression, right? And so today, in the 21st century, we view as one of the primary jobs of the government, particularly the president, to fix this, to manage this, right? And so if you're a president, the economy's good, you will typically talk about it all the time. If the economy's bad, you will blame someone else for it because it's obviously not your fault. The assumption is that if the economy's bad and you run for president, you would probably lose because we would elect the other guy who clearly would spend the entire campaign talking about how you stink at running the economy, right? And so that was a big deal because in 1992, former President George H.W. Bush ran for president, and he just won the Iraq War. So I mean, lose the presidency after winning the war against Saddam Hussein in 2 weeks, right? He crushed him. And instead, he was defeated by Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton. And the reason, at least in part, is because George H.W. Bush was bad at campaigning, and Bill Clinton was good at it. But Bill Clinton's chief political advisor was James Carville, and Carville had a giant sign in the Clinton campaign headquarters that said, "It's the economy, stupid." And every time George H.W. Bush would give these long speeches about how the Cold War had ended, we're going to manage the Cold War, we're going to transition to a new world order, we're really going to try to come up with a new way of organizing the global community because America versus Russia is over, right, because we won the Cold War. And these are all really good speeches. And in fact, George H.W. Bush deserves a lot of credit for not allowing the fall of the Soviet Union to descend into a nuclear war, which is what might well have happened, right? But he would give these big speeches about the rest of the planet Earth. And James Carville pointed out to Bill Clinton, nobody gives a shit about that. They give a shit about their paycheck, their job, their kids, and their bank account. And so he said, if someone pokes you in the eye in the middle of the night, you just sit up and you should say, it's like the economy, I care about that, jobs and stuff, right? And it worked. Every time you watch Clinton debate or talk during the campaign, that's what he would talk about. It's like, I want to make your paycheck go up, I want to make your wages go up, I want to get you a job. And George H.W. Bush appeared like he was sort of out of touch and didn't give a crap. And so Clinton did not, right? And so that upended the conventional wisdom that maybe it is the economy that matters most. Ironically, the thing that in some respects the government has the least control over, right? But that's the way that we think about it in the 21st century, right? The entire 2008 campaign, if you were Arizona Senator John McCain, was supposed to be about how the Iraq War was actually being won for the first time, and it was because everybody did what you said they should have done, which was the surge, right? Send a bunch